I've always been fascinated by how we, as rational people, try to make sense of these really mystical ideas. So, I decided to go on a bit of a journey to understand this one concept, the dark night of the soul. And wow, that journey took me from 16th century Spain all the way to our pretty chaotic world right now.
So where do you even start? Well, with the big question. It sounds poetic, doesn't it? Maybe a little dramatic even. But what in the world is the dark night of the soul?
All right, to really get this, you got to go back to the beginning. And the source of this phrase, well, it's buried deep in the heart of Christian mysticism.
Okay, so this whole phrase, it comes from a 16th century mystic, St. John of the Cross, and he described it as this absolutely gut-wrenching spiritual crisis. You feel empty, totally alone, just completely cut off from God. But, and this is the key part, it wasn't seen as the end. In fact, they saw it as this essential purification, a trial by fire you had to go through to reach a much deeper connection.
But, there's a really important distinction here that the mystics themselves made. They didn't think the soul itself was dark. Nope, it was our consciousness that gets all foggy. The analogy they used is just perfect. It's like a thick cloud blocking out a sun that's always there, always shining. Okay, so once I had a handle on the Christian side of things, my inner rationalist, my skeptical side, just couldn't help but ask, is this experience really unique? Or are we seeing echoes of it everywhere?
And that really became the driving question for this whole thing. Was I looking at something that's only a Christian phenomenon, or is this a universal human thing that just gets dressed up in different cultural outfits depending on where you look?
And you know what? When you start laying it all out side by side, these incredible patterns just pop right out. For the mystic, the problem is being cut off from God, and the fix is faith. For a Jungian psychologist, it's about being alienated from your true self, and the fix is psychological integration. And then you get a philosopher like Spinoza, who says, hold on, this isn't about God at all. It's just flawed thinking, and the fix is pure reason.
So this is the real heart of the matter, right? This massive split in worldview. On one side, you have St. John of the Cross, seeing it all as a divine test that you pass with faith. And on the other, you've got the rationalist Spinoza saying, nope, this is just a human problem you figure out with your brain. It's faith versus reason, right there in a nutshell.
And honestly, this is where things really took a turn for me. After digging into all these traditions, I started to feel this sharp, skeptical voice in my head, and it was aimed right at the emotional core of the whole mystical experience.
I mean, I had to ask, are these experiences really messages from the divine, or are they just what happens to a human brain when it's pushed to its absolute limit?
And the evidence for that second idea, it started popping up in some pretty surprising places. I read about an ex-con who had hallucinations after being in solitary. Then there's this scientist, Michel Siffre, who went through major psychological distress when he was isolated in a deep cave for an experiment. And suddenly, those visions from the mystics, people who often lived in extreme poverty and isolation, they started to look a lot less like messages from God and a lot more like a predictable psychological reaction to just complete deprivation.
So all of this led me to my big critique. This idea that Christian mysticism is just way too focused on pathos. And by pathos, I mean this glorification of suffering. It felt so directly connected to the awful conditions these mystics were living in. And it makes you wonder, right? Is this really spiritual, or is it just a religious framework for dealing with unbelievable pain?
Okay, fair warning. This next slide is pretty intense. It's maybe the most visceral, gut-punch example of this glorification of suffering. Back in the Middle Ages, some mystics would literally eat the skin and pus from lepers, all as an extreme act of devotion, to prove their piety. I mean, if that doesn't hammer home this critique of pathos, I don't know what does.
All right, so I know what you're thinking. After that gnarly trip back to the Middle Ages, why does any of this matter now? Well, because this core problem, it never really went away.
Because this whole idea of glorifying intense emotion, this pathos, it is absolutely not just something buried in a history book. It's alive and it is kicking right here, right now.
And here's the really provocative argument, that we are drifting into a kind of modern medieval age. A time where raw feeling and, let's be honest, magical thinking are pushing reason aside, and it's all being cranked up to 11 by social media.
And you don't have to look far to see the engines driving this drift, right?
It's in the explosion of conspiracy theories. It's in the crazy emotional polarization you see online. All of it fed by social media algorithms and this deep, growing distrust in our institutions. What you end up with is a culture where feeling something really, really strongly gets confused with knowing something is actually true.
So, okay, after this whole journey from ancient mystics to a sharp critique to where we are today, where does that leave me? Where does that leave a rationalist? Well, I think I found the answer, and it's on a rationalist's path forward.
And my own resolution was, well, it was totally inspired by Spinoza. First, I realized I'm not out of the dark night. It's not something you beat or overcome. Second, I just accept it. It's part of the human condition, part of the natural order of things. And third, my response isn't prayer. It's this. It's thinking, writing. It's my attempt to build a coherent, rational way of seeing the world, to stand against that rising tide of pathos.
So, what's the big takeaway here, the real punchline of this whole investigation? It's that the goal isn't to find some magic escape hatch from the darkness, from the hard parts of life.
No, it's about a total shift in how you see it. It's about seeing these crises not as some divine punishment or a personal flaw, but just as a fundamental, unavoidable piece of being a human being.
And it's about facing that darkness, not with blind faith, not with overwhelming feeling, but with the one tool we have that can actually help us make sense of the world as it really is, our reason.
So I'll just leave you with this final thought. In a world that seems to be drowning in pathos, in raw emotion, in viral outrage, in magical thinking, could it be that the simple, quiet act of using your reason is the most radical, most rebellious thing you can do?